Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back, as is Marjani Rawls. We're talking all about the 1984 movie Firestarter today. It came out in May of that year, and it is one that has some big names in it, but might not live up to expectations if you're expecting it to be good because of said big names.
Yeah, I remember like watching the movie when I was younger and then like rewatching it as I was older. I was like, oh wow, like this movie isn't as good as I thought it was.
Yeah, I literally had just watched it for the first time. So for me, I was like, oh, okay, here are some of the familiar names I know. Maybe this will be pretty good because we might as well just dive into the casting. And Drew Barrymore stars as Charlie in this. And I was like, oh, okay, this is right on the heels of E.T., basically. So maybe it'll be pretty good. But in the end, it just felt like Charlie was more of a prop than part of the story. So even though you have these familiar names, you have not only Drew Barrymore, but you have big names like Martin Sheen at the time. And he had just been in The Dead Zone previous to this. So you have some people who end up being in more than one Stephen King movie because we see Drew Barrymore again the next year in Cat's Eye. You have David Keith playing her father, Andy. Heather Locklear has a very short role as Vicky. I was like, oh, there's Heather Locklear. Oh, there she goes.
She's in it for like literally like
Maybe 5 minutes.
the beginning of the movie, and you're like, oh, there she is, and then you don't see her again. You maybe see her in like altogether 5 minutes of flashbacks, and then that's it. Then she's gone, and then they have like George C. Scott in it, and Art Carney's in it, and then like Louise Fletcher's in it too, who
Yeah.
has been in some movies. So like it's a pretty big cast for. I mean, looking at it in hindsight, 1984. This is actually a pretty like well like fleshed out cast. It's just the movie didn't really kind of utilize them as well as you would think.
Yeah. I think my only concern about the casting was the fact that they have George C. Scott, who, as far as I know, is not Native American, but he's playing this Native American character in John Rainbird. And I was like, really? You couldn't find any Native American actor for this? Not one. And, there were some at the time who were pretty big because they had done some westerns and whatnot, and they would have been the right age to sort of play the Rainbird role. So that was something I was like, oh, okay. But I guess it's the 80s, so it's not really surprising they cast a white dude in something.
Yeah, it was weird because like he had like this ponytail in the movie that like I
Yeah.
was just like he's not like this does not fit George C. Scott like Doctor Strangelove and Patton and whatnot. And now he's like this John Rainbird who's sort of deranged, and we'll get into that later. But yeah, like and then like a young Martin Sheen, like you're like looking at these
Right.
people like you're like wow, like thinking about where they are now, and then like kind of how like they are used and like go out and about in the movie. You're like, really? You couldn't do anything more? Like it's
Yeah, the thing with Martin Sheen's role too, he actually wasn't the one initially cast for that. Someone else who was older was cast, but then he ended up having to have heart surgery or something, and that's when Martin Sheen came in. And it's possibly because they had seen him in his role in The Dead Zone, where he plays sort of a similar jerk, basically. I don't know if he's ever played a good guy. To me, it seems like he's always played this sort of jerk or standoffish character. And, he fits well in the role, but I think based on the novel, you were kind of expecting something a little different because Hollister is supposed to be this older man, and in this, he is not. So you're like, oh, okay. And while I was researching this doesn't have to do with the casting, so we can kind of go into the story after this. But when I was looking some stuff up, and I recently bought the book Creep Shows, which is an illustrated movie guide for a lot of the Stephen King movies up through, I think, maybe around 2000. And in the Firestarter section, they were like, oh, yeah, John Carpenter was almost who directed this movie. And I was like,
Yeah.
man, I kind of wish I would have seen that one now. And you kind of have all of these what if moments when you find out these fun trivia facts about these movies, basically. And because I did enjoy Carpenter's Christine more than I thought I would, I'm kind of like, oh, well, what would Carpenter's Firestarter look like? Because that's something I think I'd be more interested in at this point after seeing this one. It's like you have all of these pieces that you feel like should work well together, but the story just never really ends up being quite as exciting as the book. And, I wouldn't say Firestarter is my favorite Stephen King book by any means, but in this instance, the movie really did feel like it didn't live up to what you thought of in the book. I think they portrayed the shop fairly well, but as far as the rest of the story goes, with the Manders and everything, we just see them at the tail end, and then she goes to the New York Times. And I'm pretty sure in the book she went to Rolling Stone, not the New York Times. And I'm thinking that that was just a change they made because the New York Times was one of the biggest places in New York that you could go sell your story to, but that wasn't as much of a problem as far as the actual plot goes and everything like that. But it just felt kind of boring and long. I don't think this needed to be nearly 2 hours. I think they could have cut this down to around an hour and a half.
Yeah, I think Ebert said that it was really boring, and Stephen King said it definitely wasn't one of his favorite movies. He called it flavorless. I
Yeah.
remember that, and I'm sad because I think John Carpenter would have done a really good job with this, but I think The Thing was like a disappointment, so they took him off it, and then they rewrote the screenplay with somebody else,
Yeah.
and you could kind of like definitely tell like it's the movie to me. Like I'm a big David Cronenberg fan, and it seemed like it was very Cronenberg light. Like it was just like trying to kind of like do that, like what he did with like if you look at a movie like Scanners, like it was like that, but like it wasn't as interesting.
Even what he did with the Dead Zone was
Yeah,
more interesting. And I think that was a very well done adaptation for the time period. And with this one, the effects were kind of cool, but as far as the story goes, it's like, all right, we don't really get a feel for Charlie as a character. She's sort of just this prop to everyone. The shop wants to get her for her abilities and basically use her as a weapon. And her dad just thinks he needs to protect her. And yes, part of that is in the book as well. But when you have someone who is coming off of a big role in E.T., and she is clearly capable of hitting some of these emotional beats, but she kind of just comes off as whiny when she doesn't get what she wants. And I'm sure a lot of kids obviously come across that way, but given her power, the fact that you have those moments and they just didn't translate well on screen, it's a little disappointing.
yeah, it was weird because they. I mean, obviously, like, you look at the poster and stuff like that. They're pushing, Drew Barrymore as the person, but it wasn't really. I didn't feel like it was really her movie. I felt like it was more kind of split between her and Andy, and then it was more about the shop.
Yeah, it was what do the adults want to do with Charlie?
And like especially with Rainbird and like Hollister, like it was like more about their story. It was like I already kind of know what they want to do. You know what I mean? Like Rainbird's kind of like thoughts on what to do with Charlie was a little bit more. It came off really really weird, and there was like a gray area where it was kind of uncomfortable. But like it like you said, it was focused on the adults a lot, and I'm like, well, I kind of want to know more about Charlie. Like you find out a little bit in the beginning of the movie, I guess when they talk about Vicky,
Yeah.
with the 10 minutes that she's in. But then that's kind of it. I feel like the movie should have been titled like, What to Do with Charlie.
Yeah. Plus, they did so much with Rainbird in the book that didn't really ultimately add up to us feeling any compassion towards his character or anything like that. He's sort of just this plot tool to get us to Charlie destroying everything. And that's how the movie felt too. But they did it on a much creepier level, I think. And I don't know if it's just because we're then visually seeing this relationship he tried to have with Charlie in order to manipulate her and win her over and everything like that. Whereas in the book, it's a little more open to interpretation. And I didn't see it as quite as creepy. I mean, he was someone who you could tell didn't want anything good to come of this. But in the movie, it's like, you know what? I think he's trying to be a little too friendly with her, wanting to play video games with her. And, he's just this random dude. If it was someone she had already known, it wouldn't be nearly as weird. But yeah, something just felt very off about the Rainbird performance, aside from it not being cast as a Native American actor.
No, it's like you said, like in the book, he's definitely, there's a means to an end to him. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't want anybody to come out of it. And in the movie, you kind of get to that point, but getting to that point, you feel so uncomfortable. Like, you're like, ugh, like, what does this old man want to hang out with, like like 9, 10 year old for? You know what I mean? Like, and like I mean, we'll get into it more, but yeah, like, I don't know. I felt like you didn't have to write it that way. You know what I mean? He could have
Yeah.
just been, you could have been, all right, you know what I mean? Like, we have, this girl who has like this power. Okay, we got to do something about it. But it took turns and stuff that you're just like, ugh, like, especially like the first uh discussion that Hollister and Rainbow have about her, like what they wanted to do. I was like, ew, man, like what is going on here? Like, what are they agreeing to?
Right. And you can tell that Martin Sheen's character, Captain Hollister, wants to use her more as a weapon. He gets very excited and eager when he can see with his own eyes what she can do when they're in the testing rooms and everything. But then Rainbird just kind of sits there and doesn't really have a reaction to her powers one way or the other. And the entire time, you can feel like he has a different plan for her. And when the storm comes and the power goes out, she just goes in her room, all right, whatever, power's out. And he just starts banging on the door to her bedroom. And it's like, okay, this is a little too over the top and a little too weird.
Yeah, she has to like comfort him, and like, but then like there was a camera shot that happens in that scene where I guess he puts his hand on her leg, and I was like, oh, okay, like what? Why is it? What is this? Doesn't add to the movie at all. I guess they're trying to push that like whole like relationship. I'm like, ew, like what the hell is going on here? Like, why? I don't know. Like, it kind of goes back to what you said. Like, why Charlie, like, why is she's just kind of just getting past, like, all right, well, she has powers here. We need her as a weapon, or he apparently wants her as a companion or whatnot, or her dad is trying to like hone in her powers and whatnot, and trying to like not let herself blame for what happened to her mom. I don't know, like, I didn't feel like, I felt like us getting there to her being like, having her like courageous spot at the end. Like, I felt so like, ugh, like they put this little girl through so much.
Yeah, it was a very odd turn of events. And, like I said, the book wasn't one of my favorite ones, but after reading it, I was kind of excited to see the movie. And then I watched it and I was like, oh, that wasn't as exciting as I thought it would be. It was kind of just a movie that happened. It took a lot of things directly from the book, but sometimes you have to change things up just a little bit to make it a little more interesting, because something can be explained in much more detail in a book in a way that might be boring for the movies. And I felt like we had a lot of low moments in this where it's just like, okay, cool, they got to the cabin, they're doing their thing, they went to the post office, and it just wasn't too exciting until you had Charlie actually doing something. And for a good majority of the movie, she wasn't. And I think, maybe if they had sprinkled in some more of those flashback moments to her trying to learn how to control her powers, we really only get the one
Yeah.
where she sets the oven mitts on fire as her mom is wearing them, and then they freak out, and then they just sort of cut away from that until we see Vicky's death. And it's like, oh, okay. All right, that's cool. We could have had a little more backstory that I think would have filled the time in the movie a little better than some of the other scenes.
Yeah, watching this movie, most of it felt like watching two different movies. Like it was like a runaway heist movie, kind of like with them on the run and like trying to escape from the shop and whatnot. And then like the second half was kind of like science fiction movie. Like they kind of sprinkled the science fiction stuff in, but like then like when they're trying to like do the experiments like to try to get her powers out and whatnot, like then it was like the science fiction stuff. So like you said, like maybe some flashback stuff would have fleshed out the movie more because there's a lot of like dead time. There's a lot of like there's a lot of conversations that Andy and Charlie have that like it's just like all right, we get that like there's this like father daughter dynamic where he's trying to like comfort her and like all right, well like you controlled your powers that time, like you didn't let them go out of control, but like it was like the first act of the movie was pretty much all that, and I'm like all right, like you know what I mean, like this is kind of dragging.
Yeah, there are a few things I think they could have done that would have either cut down on the movie and made it a little tighter of an edit, or they could have expanded on things like what exactly the shop was. We sort of get this explanation from Andy when he's talking to Mr. Manders, and it would have been nicer if they could have sort of shown us that instead of telling us that, because we do get the flashback to the drug trial and everything like that, but we really don't know too much about why the shop even exists, I guess. And maybe that's because it's supposed to be a secret agency, so we're not supposed to know. But I feel like that might have been a little more interesting. And I believe the shop comes up in some other things later on down the line in the Stephen King universe. But overall, it just felt like they had some good ideas and they just ultimately did not execute them well. And, I ended up giving this, I think, a 2.5 out of 5, which isn't horrible, isn't bad. It was sort of just a very middle of the road movie. And one of the main reasons why is because you have these big names, and I feel like other than Martin Sheen, really, none of them quite lived up to expectations. Martin Sheen was definitely like the perfect jerk who sort of just had this big ego and knew exactly what he wanted. And he seemed to possibly be the only one who knew what he wanted and how he was going to try and get it. Everyone else was sort of just going with the flow and having weird stuff go on, especially Rainbird, and trying to figure things out. And you have this moment later on where Andy is basically tricking them into thinking he's excited about taking his medicine. And I was like, that's very unrealistic. Why would any of them believe that he's that excited to take his medicine? And they could have simply just shown him spitting out his meds in the bathroom like they do later. We didn't need this whole drawn out thing of someone coming in with his medicine, him getting excited, and then waiting for them to leave. And it's like, just, your audience isn't that stupid. You could have just shown him spitting them out.
Like he has telekinesis, like he really needs to like lie and like, well, I'm excited to take the medicine, and like couldn't it, like there was little things in the movie. I'm like, couldn't he just use his telekinetic powers to like? But I guess like he had to like kind of coax them into like thinking like, all right, like I want to kind of subdue my powers a little bit.
I think he was trying to rest up enough to have enough energy left in him to use his powers as much as he did towards the end, because my guess is, and they had said this earlier on, that whenever he uses his powers, he tends to fall asleep. And we see that in the cab when he tells the guy to
Yeah,
go to the airport with the dollar bill, and he makes it look like a $500 bill instead, which, not a thing, at least not anymore. Might have been
yeah.
at one point in time for a very, very brief period of time, but it was one of those things where you're like, okay, so we're figuring out a little more about his powers as we go. But at the very beginning of the movie, too, to backtrack a little here, they were just straight up telling us what their powers were, as if we wouldn't figure that out once they started using them.
The flashback scene with when when Vicky and Andy like meet each other, was hilarious
Yeah.
because they start like reading each other's like thoughts or whatnot, and like they reach each other's hands like, "I've always loved you. I loved you too." And I'm like, "What? Like what? Like
I think the nice thing about that moment was the fact that they showed us what Vicky's powers were without
yeah,
having to flat out tell us. But when the shop is chasing down Andy and Charlie at the beginning, they're like, "Oh yeah, don't look at him. He can make you do whatever he wants." And it's like, "Oh, yes, thank you for that. We would not have figured that out."
yeah. Oh yeah. And then the whole fire thing, and then at the airport where Charlie like at least Charlie there has like you can see that she has compassion for people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Even though like it seems like the adults don't have compassion for her in the damn movie. She has compassion where like this jerk is saying to like his girlfriend like, "Oh, you've been with other guys and blah blah blah," and she puts his feet on fire. So he runs. Another funny scene. He runs into the bathroom and then jumps into the toilet.
Yeah.
And then the cop is like, "Hey, hold it right there." And he's like, "Can I at least put my feet out first?" So like, there's a whole bunch of unintentional funny scenes throughout the whole movie, especially like when Herb's character, when the shop gets to the house and what
Yeah.
he says, oh my God. The guy, he's like, "Get off my damn property." You know what I mean? Like, do you have a warrant? And the guy's like, "Well, we're from the government." Like, he's like, "Well, if you don't have a warrant, you got to get out of here." And he's like, "What is this?" He's like, "Unless I woke up in Russia." Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "Wow, timely."
It's funny how some of these things come back around, and it's like, oh wow, that's a very timely comment in 2019 somehow.
And then the whole thing happens where Charlie uses her powers like for like a big scene for the first time and like makes somebody spontaneously combust, and then the main agent's like, "No, don't." And like and he busts on fire, and then my man Irv retells the whole thing that we just saw, and then he mentions them like the government about the secret police. He's like, "What do you expect me to do? Turn them over? Like be a good Nazi?" I was like, "Oh my god!" Like, this guy is against like the old like crotchety grandpa and whatnot. It was. I just thought that the dialogue was funny.
Yeah, well, do you have anything else you want to talk about specifically regarding the story before we move on to some of the not so great and somewhat better visual effects in this movie?
No, we can move on.
So, one of the things that I noticed throughout this was that they did have some actual real fires going on. And I read up on the movie and was able to confirm that because they had firefighters and whatnot on set basically anytime they were doing a lot of these effects because they were actually putting up these facades and burning them down. So they made sure that there wasn't a single person injured on set, which is great. But then in that big climactic scene towards the end there, when Charlie is just completely annihilating the shop, you have like these fireballs just being thrown at people. And I didn't remember that from the book, so it threw me off. I was like, wait, I know she can start fires, but I didn't know she could also just throw fire at people. It looked like you had these literal meteorites being thrown at people, and I was like, what is going on? And those didn't look so great because you knew those had to be, at least somewhat CGI for the 80s, but I was just like, what is going on here? Because she's already started the fires, so how is she just like throwing these things? And then the whole stopping bullets thing, you could kind
Oh.
of tell it almost looked like they were just shooting off fireworks in front of her.
Oh man, that Rainbird bullet. Let me tell you, I I was like, it left the gun, and it looked like pixel art. Like it looks like I'm like, okay, I understand that she has like telekinetic powers, right? But her main power is to start fires, like to create heat. So is she creating enough heat to stop a bullet now? Because like now we're like getting into Matrix territory.
Yeah, I think what it was that she was heating up the bullet so that it exploded before it had an impact. And it was one of those things where I was like, yeah, okay, I guess I get that. But then why didn't she stop the bullet that shot her dad, if she stopped all of the other ones, I was like, okay, that's a thing. I'm just going to let it go. We're just going to let it go because we know how this has to end.
And I feel like, especially in the barn when Andy gets shot, I don't know what. I think the director was Mark L. Lester. So like the motive, I don't know if he told like everybody to overact, but like he gets shot and she goes to him. She's like, "Oh my God, Dad, you're bleeding." He got shot, so like of course that like I'm like, well, of course, like you know what I mean. Like a bullet would cause that, and I feel like in a lot of like the screenplay and a lot of moments in this movie that they had people like basically like blatantly like, oh my God, like you know what I mean, like she made that thing, combust on fire. It was like I just saw it, like I
Yeah.
I know, you know what I mean.
Yeah, it was a lot of them having to tell you what happened. Even when we could visually see it, it's like, yes, thank you, that's a fire. And I don't really like it when movies sort of treat the audience that way because, like I said, it's one thing in a book because you can't see it happening. So they have to sometimes maybe even over explain things to really drill it into your head. But when you can see these things happening on the TV screen, you're like, okay, yeah, you don't really need to tell me. It's like, yes, thank you. We know. We have eyes.
I feel like when they rewrote the screenplay and like Stanley Man rewrote it, I feel like they kind of like did a whole thing word for word from the book,
Yeah.
and then like it didn't translate to the movie. Parts of the dialogue here is like you're reading book dialogue, and then it when you're looking at the screen, it's like dude, I know. So it's like it's like some part of the movie. It just feels like a dress rehearsal because like it's just like the blocking, like it's like character walks here, character gets caught on fire here. Drew Barrymore cries. Like it feels that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as the fire goes, that's sort of the main visual effect we have in this movie. That's what Charlie's power is. She can set things on fire. So, I thought it was well done, like when she lit the soldier's shoes on fire. It wasn't too pixely or overdone to where you're like, oh, okay, clearly that's how that went. And because I think they did set some actual fires, that helps a lot when you're looking
Hmm.
at these things visually. But then when the fire is just being pelted at people, I was like, no, that's not really how this works. You cannot direct fire to move these things exactly where you want them to. And I guess, maybe she has a combination of being able to move things with her mind, but when you have this ability to start fires, usually it's just that. And we don't see her move anything else with her mind. So when I saw those things flying at the people, I was just kind of like, okay, where did this come from? And, maybe that's something that is in the book and I just didn't interpret it that way. But seeing it on the big screen, I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. I'll just let it go because we know she has to destroy this place anyway.
There's this like conversation that Dr. Joseph has with like Rainbird and Hollister in the office talking about her that like gets like weird. Like
Yeah.
he's like he talks about like lot six and then like the pituitary gland and whatnot. He talks about her. He's like, what if her powers grow? What are you gonna do then? And then he mentions, he's like, what if there's some girl out there who hasn't unlocked her abilities that could be able to crack a planet in two? And I'm like, doesn't the drug like help you like uncover those powers? So if she hasn't take lock six, then how would that even unlock? Like what is going like what? And then that kind of like pushes Rainbird and Hollister's like, all right, we got to do something. And I'm like, that was what made you want to do something? Somebody who's completely like unattached to what's going on with Andy and Charlie.
Yeah, with Dr. Joseph, you can tell that he's the one who is actually scared of what she can do because she's, like you said, 8 to 10 years old, somewhere around that range. She's 8 in real life, Drew Barrymore is, when they do this movie, but you have this young child who isn't fully developed yet. So it's like, okay, what happens when she becomes a teenager and has all of these hormones going and everything like that, and she can't really control certain aspects as well as you would be able to if you were an adult. And there's just this lethalness to her that is not something that she can completely control. You know, she has to tell herself to back off like 800 times before she can control this. And I feel like after the first time of her doing that, maybe that's something she could have just thought in her head, because I feel like almost half of her lines consisted of back off in one way or another. And, you know, visually, it's like, okay, we can see that there's water in the room. You don't need to tell us that the water will put out the fire, you know?
Yeah, they all yeah, there always had to be like boiling water somewhere, even in the barn. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like they had to show like the chickens running away from the boiling water.
Yeah. It's like, okay, thank you for that. You know, we didn't know what put fires out. But anyway, I think, you know, we don't have to keep this too long because it seems like we're in agreement that this movie was sort of just very middle of the road. I might even end up changing my ranking to 2 out of 5. I don't know. It's one of those things where I thought it was mostly not great. And I'm going into a lot of these 80s movies just very aware of what the limitations are for certain movies like this. And I've been saying a lot that practical effects obviously stand the test of time much better than CGI that is not well developed at that point in time at all. So at least they did have some of those practical effects that make the movie bearable to watch still, even if the writing is sort of the main problem for this movie, I would say. But MJ, do you have any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
One of my final thoughts, and it has to go with the practical effects thing. The Rainbird scene when he kills Joseph Wainless was again one of the funniest scenes ever.
Yeah.
So he walks into his bedroom, like somehow gets close enough in his bed, tickles him, wakes him up, and then karate chops him. I karate chops his face, and you could see where they cut to put the dummy in.
Yeah.
So like his face turns rubber, and then all of a sudden, like there's just blood. I'm like, so he killed him that way? Like,
Yeah, and then he sort of explains it later on when he's talking to Captain Hollister about, you know, hitting him in the face and breaking his nose and having shards go into the brain. And it's like, yeah, but I don't think that's how you do that. I don't think you karate chop someone and that's how that happens.
I'm like, oh man, like you could definitely tell that was a dummy. Like, you know what I mean? Like it was like the cut wasn't that great.
Yeah, yeah, it was funny because I thought I noticed that too, because he does the karate chop and then all of a sudden the face is all smushed in this weird way. And then there's blood and you're like, okay, that's cool. I don't really know what just happened.
And then he just like stands there and smiles creepily and
Yeah.
whatnot.
He definitely had the creepy look down. I'll give him credit for that, but otherwise very strange character.
Yeah, that was my final thought. That there were a lot of like moments in the movie that were not supposed to be funny that they were really funny. So like it goes back to what you said. Like I watch these movies now because I watched these when I was younger. So I was watching them with like kind of rose-colored glasses. Like, oh my god, like she's throwing fireballs like Liu Kang in Mortal Kombat. But now like I'm older, I'm watching this. I'm like, ooh, like maybe this wasn't as great and whatnot. And then maybe, watching the first half of the movie and like her kind of going into like, oh my God, like I lit my mom on fire. And then like, will I ever be normal and stuff like that. I felt like that was kind of like the good parts of the first half. Like I felt like, all right, like we have this like kid who has these powers who can't understand them, who's trying to control them, whose damn dad is like pressuring her, saying like, you gotta get a hold of this because this is bad. And then like turning around and like saying, like she's like, will I ever be normal? Like, will I ever go to school? He's like, of course. I'm like, really?
Nope, nope, nope.
I'm like, I understand that she has a kid, and like as a dad, like you have to like tell, but like she just lit somebody on fire to death. So you want her to like go to school? So yeah, I like you kind of like take this movie for what it is, but like it's just kind of I'm just going off of what you just said. Like, yeah, man, this movie was. Yeah. I mean, we recorded Cujo, and I thought Cujo was kind of ah.
Yeah.
Cujo was like a little better, but like yeah.
It's one of those things where certain stories are just very hard to adapt to the big screen or the small screen. And you can tell with this one because it didn't do very well at the box office either. I'm going based off of a combination of Wikipedia and Box Office Mojo here. So, according to Wikipedia, the budget was 12 million and it made around 17 to 18 million
Ugh.
according to Box Office Mojo overall. That's not even like opening weekend or anything. And in the 80s, Stephen King was a big enough name to get a lot of people to the theater. So the fact that this one didn't do as well with the cast members that it had, it's kind of like, oh, okay, so we weren't the only ones who didn't like this all that much.
That's crazy having a budget with like the cast members that were in the movie. Like it's a $12 million budget. Like that's crazy, especially with Drew Barrymore, a young Drew Barrymore coming off E.T.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens when I watch Cat's Eye with her in that, just to sort of compare and see how her performance differs. And I think some of the same people worked on Cat's Eye as well,
Yeah.
on the back end and on the crew end and everything like that. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. But I'm very glad you and I were on the same page with this movie because, you signed up for it. And I think you kind of knew at the time when you signed up for it that it wasn't the best movie, but someone had to talk about it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. I had to see it again, like I said, like not 12-year-old MJ or like 15-year-old MJ. I had to see like me now, and like yeah, like it's definitely different.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, MJ. And to our listeners, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Chat Cemetery. You can subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. We have a link where you can sort of just go and find all the places you can subscribe. So I'll be sure to include that. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.